What happens when a man who thinks money is everything collapses alone only to be saved by the worker he never even called by name? The summer sun shimmered off the polished hood of the black Lincoln sedan as Derrick eased it to a smooth stop outside the towering glass and marble headquarters of Whitmore and Co. The building stood like a monument to power, sleek, imposing, and cold. Derrick shifted the gear into park, his hands moving with practiced precision, then rested them on the steering wheel as he exhaled slowly. 4 years. That's how long he'd been parking here. 4 years of early mornings, polished shoes and pressed collars. 4 years of memorizing traffic patterns, knowing the CEO's coffee order by scent alone, and anticipating moods before a single word was spoken. He was never late, never missed a turn. Not once had the car returned with so much as a fingerprint. Out of place. But in those 4 years, he'd never been invited past the lobby. He wasn't Derrick. He wasn't Mr. Carter. He wasn't even, "Hey, man." He was just driver. Through the tinted glass, he watched as suits and stilettos streamed through the revolving doors, none of them acknowledging the man behind the wheel. To them, he was a fixture and extension of the vehicle. Present, functional, invisible. Then came the sound of heavy saws clapping against the concrete steps, measured, confident, entitled. Mr. Whitmore emerged, a phone pressed to his ear, barking into it with the casual arrogance of someone who hadn't heard the word no in decades. Sell it. I don't care what they say. Liquidate the account. If they want to whine, let them sue. He didn't break stride as he passed the car. His eyes never flicked toward the windshield. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but dismissal. Wait in the car, he muttered, already halfway through another sentence on the call. Derrick didn't reply. He just gave the smallest nod and folded his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the side mirror. It was always like this. He watched as Mr. Whitmore greeted 2 men in suits at the curb. Both men looked toward the car momentarily. One gestured. Mr. Whitmore laughed, said something inaudible, and the 3 of them headed inside, leaving Derrick behind without so much as a glance. He didn't expect introductions. Not anymore. It wasn't just that Mr. Whitmore never said his name. It was how he spoke around him, as if he were part of the furniture. When clients asked who was driving, Whitmore would wave a dismissive hand and say, "It's fine. He's my guy." No mention of Derrick's years of service. No acknowledgement of the long nights, the snowstorms driven through, the time he'd waited 5 hours during a board meeting with nothing but a stale vending machine sandwich. Inside the car, the air conditioner hummed. Derrick adjusted the vent, letting the cool breeze hit his face, but it did little to push back the creeping heat of humiliation that had become far too familiar. Still, he said nothing. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a small cloth, and began wiping a fingerprint he'd noticed on the touchscreen earlier. It wasn't his, but he cleaned it anyway. Across the street, 2 construction workers shared a laugh. One had grease on his cheek, the other a neon vest that glinted in the sun. They looked over, nodded at Derrick. He nodded back, grateful for the small human acknowledgement. His phone buzzed softly in the center console. A message from his wife. "How's it going today? Need anything for dinner?" He smiled faintly, typing back, "All good. Just the usual." He didn't mention the silence, the lack of a name, the way Mr. Whitmore never once asked about his life, his kids, or what he dreamed about when he wasn't driving someone else toward theirs. Because Derrick wasn't here for validation. He was here to provide. Rent didn't care about respect. Groceries didn't care about dignity. And so he drove. He adjusted his posture, sat up straight, and glanced at the time. 15 minutes past the scheduled pickup. Meetings always ran long on Wednesdays. He knew that. He also knew Whitmore liked the car to be a precise 71 degrees when he returned. So, Derrick tapped the temperature down 2 clicks, wiped the dash one more time, and resumed waiting still and steady, as he always was. Outside, the day carried on people hustling, laughing, yelling into phones, chasing their ambitions up staircases lined with gold-trimmed elevators. Inside the car, Derrick sat in silence, the city reflecting off the windshield. He didn't move. He didn't complain, because, in a world that barely saw him, Derrick had made himself indispensable, even if they didn't know his name yet. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, softening the harsh lines of the Whitmore & Co. headquarters. Inside the car, Derrick sat with the engine running, the quiet hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. It was the kind of stillness he'd grown used to, routine, predictable, almost comforting. He tapped the steering wheel lightly with his fingers, eyes drifting across the dashboard clock. 3 minutes past schedule. Whitmore was usually punctual, but when meetings ran late, Derrick knew to wait without question. That was part of the unspoken contract. Patience, discretion, invisibility. He leaned back slightly, stretching his neck. When the faint crackle of the car's built-in intercom system buzzed to life. It wasn't intentional. Most days, Whitmore forgot to mute the channel that connected his office suite to the vehicle's console. Normally, it carried idle fragments of conversation finance jargon, executive ego, the occasional off-color joke he'd trained himself to ignore. But today, the tone was different. "Look," came Whitmore's voice, sharp, clipped, and irritated. "I said cut the extras. We're burning money on fluff." There was a pause. A muffled voice HR perhaps offered a hesitant rebuttal. "No, I don't need the driver anymore," Whitmore snapped. "I'll call a rideshare like everyone else. It's not the 1950s. I don't need someone opening my door like I'm royalty." Derrick froze. The words hung in the cabin like smoke-thin, toxic, impossible to ignore. His hand hovered near the volume dial, but he didn't turn it off. He couldn't. The silence after Whitmore's rant was almost louder than the voice itself. There was no discussion about Derrick's performance. No mention of the years of service, the sacrifices. Just a sterile phrase, "Cut the extras." As if he were some unwanted line item on a spreadsheet, a luxury to be trimmed. He sat still for a long time after the intercom went dead. Outside, the wind rustled the trees along the lot, and a paper cup danced across the pavement. Derrick's eyes stayed fixed on the dashboard, on nothing at all. He wasn't surprised, not exactly. He'd known how Whitmore saw him. But knowing and hearing were two different things. The rest of the week passed in a blur of empty drives and forced normalcy. Whitmore never mentioned the conversation, never hinted that anything had changed. He still barked orders from the back seat, still answered phone calls as if Derrick weren't 3 feet away. And Derrick, he played along. He drove as smoothly as ever. He didn't ask questions. He didn't let on that he knew. But in the quiet moments, when the traffic lights turned red or the car idled outside another boardroom, his mind wandered. He thought of his kids, of the rent due next month, of the way his wife kissed his cheek before dawn that morning, whispering, "I'm proud of you." He thought of how he would tell her. And then Friday came. It was just before noon. The sky was overcast now, casting a silver gloom over the city. Derrick had just parked in his usual spot behind the building when a young intern approached, nervous, hesitant, holding a slim manila envelope. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to give you this." The intern mumbled, avoiding Derrick's eyes as he extended the envelope with 2 hands, like it was something fragile or shameful. Derrick took it without a word. The weight of it felt wrong, too light to carry anything good. The intern scurried off, and Derrick stood alone beside the car, fingers tightening around the paper, He didn't need to open it. He already knew, but he did, slowly, carefully, as if the envelope might bite. Inside was a single-page letter, typed and impersonal. Effective immediately, your services will no longer be required. Enclosed is your final payment and severance as outlined in your original contract. We appreciate your time with Whitmore & Co. and wish you well in your future endeavors. No name. No signature. Just severance and silence. Derrick stood there for a long time, staring at the letter as the wind tugged gently at his jacket. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm chirped. Life continued. The world didn't stop because one man's dignity had just been folded and sealed into an envelope. He climbed into the car one last time, not to drive, but to breathe. To sit in the space he'd made his own for 4 years. His hands ran slowly across the steering wheel, memorizing the feel of the leather, the stitching, the controls he could operate with his eyes closed. It wasn't just a car. It was a ritual, a routine, a livelihood. And now it was gone. He glanced into the rearview mirror. No Whitmore. No barking orders. Just his own eyes staring back, tired, but unbroken. He took one final look at the building, the cold glass reflecting. A sky that looked like it might rain. Then he turned the key, shut off the engine, and stepped out. Not a word, not a scene. Just quiet dignity in the face of quiet betrayal. And with that, Derrick walked away from the job that had never seen him, not knowing the world was about to turn. Derrick didn't slam the door when he came home. He didn't cry, curse, or kick the kitchen chair. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he stepped inside quietly, placed his keys in the small ceramic dish by the door, and kissed his wife on the forehead. She looked up from the stove, reading the truth in his eyes before he could speak it. "He let you go," she said softly. Derrick nodded. Just like that. She didn't ask for details. She wrapped her arms around his waist and held him in the stillness of their small kitchen, the smell of garlic and onions rising like warmth between them. That night, while his kids played in the living room and laughter drifted down the hallway, Derrick sat alone at the dining table with a notepad. Numbers, ideas, roots. His old 2009 sedan still ran well-needed new brakes. Maybe, and he had a small amount saved from side gigs and overtime pay. He couldn't afford to grieve. By the end of the week, he had a name, Carter Rides, just one car, just him. Clean, punctual, polite. The way he'd always been. He made business. Cards at the print shop on Main. He talked to barbers, grocery clerks, anyone who might pass a word along. His wife built a basic website. His daughter helped him make a free Instagram account. It was small, humble, but it was his. And slowly, the phone began to ring. 2 weeks later, Derrick sat in his old sedan, parked near a local coffee shop tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. The afternoon was unusually warm, the kind of heat that made the pavement blur and conversations slow. He sipped a lukewarm coffee and glanced at the time. His next client was running late. The shop's patio was busy, people hunched over laptops, chatting quietly. Derrick leaned back in the driver's seat, letting the breeze from the cracked window wash over him. And that's when he saw her. Grace Whitmore. She was standing just past the edge of the patio, phone to her ear, eyes wide with panic. Her other hand gripped her bag tightly, as if it might anchor her to the sidewalk. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, and her voice, though muffled, was unmistakably frantic. Derrick's breath caught. She hadn't seen him yet. She was pacing in small, sharp circles, dialing someone else now, only to curse and hang up. He opened his door and stepped out. "Grace?" he called gently. Her head snapped up. When she saw him, something in her face broke relief, desperation, familiarity. "Derrick," she cried, rushing toward him. It's my dad. He collapsed. What? His voice was calm, but his heart had already jumped into motion. Where? In the car, she gasped, pulling at his sleeve. He was supposed to pick me up, but when I got there, he was slumped over in the back seat. I didn't know what to do. I tried calling for help, but my phone keeps dropping, and I can't find a taxi, please. He didn't ask another. Questioned out, he opened the passenger door for her and got behind the wheel. Take me there, he said, shifting into gear before she could even close the door. The streets blurred past them. Grace sat beside him, wiping her face, giving directions between shaky breaths. I think it's a stroke, she whispered. He was sweating. I tried shaking him. He didn't respond. Derrick gripped the wheel tighter. He knew that street. He knew the area. And he knew exactly where Whitmore would have parked if he didn't have a driver. The irony struck him like a slap. He was alone because he chose to be. But this wasn't the time. They pulled up to the scene moments later. The luxury car, a sleek, high-end European model, was still idling by the curb, its windows fogged. Through the glass, Derrick could see Whitmore's figure slumped unnaturally in the back seat, head resting against the leather with a wet patch of sweat darkening his collar. Derrick ran. He yanked open the back door and checked for a pulse. Weak butt. There. Sir? He said, gently shaking Whitmore's shoulder. No response. He turned to Grace. Call 911 again. Tell them he's unresponsive but breathing. I'll keep him stable. She nodded, voice trembling as she relayed the details. Derrick lowered the seat, loosened Whitmore's tie, and began checking his vitals just as the sound of distant sirens began to rise. Whitmore stirred, briefly eyes fluttering open for a split second. Just long enough to see Derrick's face hovering above his own. His lips moved, barely audible. You... Then they closed again. The paramedics arrived in minutes. Derrick stepped back as they took over, answering a few questions, then letting Grace clutch her father's hand as they loaded him into the ambulance. She turned to Derrick, voice cracking. Thank you, she whispered. He simply nodded, jaw tight, eyes focused. Not on her, but on the man who once called him just a driver, now lying helpless, having collapsed alone in the back seat of a car, because he thought no one like Derrick was worth keeping around. The city buzzed with its usual urgency cars weaving through narrow lanes, horns blaring in frustration, sunlight bouncing off windshields like tiny explosions. But for Derrick, time had narrowed to a pinpoint. Everything outside the car was noise, everything inside focus. Grace sat beside him, clutching her phone with trembling fingers, her knuckles pale. Her breaths came in short, shallow bursts. Panic hovered in her throat, like something waiting to erupt. There, she gasped, pointing through the windshield. That's the car. Derrick pulled into the turning lane, heart pounding. A black rental sedan, foreign, expensive, out of place, sat awkwardly along the median of a crowded intersection. Hazard lights blinked, but no one had approached. Cars slowed, honked, then kept going. No one stopped. He slammed the car into park and jumped out. The air hit him like a furnace thick, heavy, suffocating. He sprinted across the asphalt, but barely hearing Grace behind him. His shoes slapped the pavement as he reached the rear door and yanked it open. Inside, Mr. Whitmore lay sprawled across the back seat. His face was ashen, lips slightly blue. A film of sweat coated his forehead, and his chest rose and fell in uneven, desperate waves. Mr. Whitmore? Derrick said, his voice sharp, commanding. No response. Derrick's hands moved with instinct. He reached for Whitmore's wrist pulse, faint but present. He checked his airway. Clear. Behind him, Grace was crying now. Is he? What do we? Call 911. Now, Derrick ordered. Tell them he's unconscious. Likely cardiac or stroke related. Send paramedics to 5th and Rose. She nodded through tears and fumbled with her phone. Derrick eased Whitmore down along the seat, then climbed halfway into the car, bracing himself on his knees. Whitmore wasn't breathing properly anymore. His chest had stilled. "Come on," Derrick muttered, already lowering the seat and positioning Whitmore flat. "Don't you dare give up now." He tilted Whitmore's head back, checked once more for signs of breath, and when none came, he started compressions. 1, 2, 3 Derrick's hands pressed into the man's chest in perfect rhythm. He'd taken CPR training years ago for the chauffeur license requirement, never imagining he'd use it like this. Not here, not on this man. The city kept moving around them. No one stopped. No one noticed, but Derrick kept going. Grace stood by the open door, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaking down her face as she tried to stay composed, tried to believe this wasn't the end. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't let him die." Derrick didn't respond. He just kept pressing steady, strong, relentless. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into seconds, the faint sound of sirens pierced the chaos. Red lights reflected off windows. Tires screeched. Uniforms blurred into view. 2 paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher, one shouting over the noise, "Sir, step back. We've got it from here." Derrick moved instantly, wiping sweat from his forehead, stepping aside as they took over. He didn't realize until then that his shirt was soaked through, his breath shallow from the effort. One medic turned to him. "You kept him alive." That might have made all the difference. He nodded, too winded to speak. Whitmore stirred under the oxygen mask, his eyelids fluttering. One hand twitched. They hoisted him onto the stretcher, checking vitals, adjusting lines as they prepared to lift him into the ambulance. Whitmore opened his eyes just barely glazed, confused, weak. His gaze shifted from the ceiling of the ambulance bay to the man standing just outside the door. Derrick stood still, hands on his hips, chest rising with deep, exhausted breaths. Next to him, Grace held onto his forearm like it was the only stable thing in the world. And Whitmore saw it. Saw Derrick holding his daughter's hand. His face flickered, not in recognition, but something deeper. Bewilderment, regret, a memory half-formed. "You?" he rasped, eyes fluttering again. Derrick didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just looked at the man who'd once reduced him to a title, a number, a disposable name on a spreadsheet. And now that man lay broken in the back of a car he couldn't drive, on a road he couldn't navigate, saved by the hands he'd once dismissed. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, a siren wailed to life again and faded into the distance. Derrick remained still, not out of shock, but clarity. Grace turned to him slowly. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady now. "If you hadn't been there," he looked at her and nodded. "I was just doing what needed to be done." But in his heart he knew he hadn't just saved a man. He'd reclaimed something that had been stolen long ago, not with revenge, but with grace. The hospital room was filled with the low hum of machines, steady beeps, gentle hisses of oxygen, and the distant chatter of nurses in the corridor. Harsh fluorescent light reflected off the sterile white walls, making the room feel more like a holding chamber than a place of healing. Derrick stood quietly, just outside the doorway. He hadn't meant to stay long. He only came to check on Grace, to make sure she was okay. She'd texted him after the ambulance arrived at the hospital, thanking him again. Her words were simple, but the tremble in the message had been unmistakable. Now, she sat at her father's bedside, fingers wrapped gently around his. Mr. Whitmore looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. He was propped up against a pillow, 4 tubings snaking from his wrist, heart monitor pulsing beside him. The man who once filled rooms with his arrogance now seemed weighed down by something heavier than illness. Regret. When he saw Derrick in the hallway, something shifted behind his eyes. Shame. Hesitation. He cleared his throat. Derrick, could I speak with you for a moment? Derrick glanced at Grace. She gave a slight nod, subtle, encouraging. He stepped inside. The air was cooler here, heavy with antiseptic and unspoken words. Whitmore motioned toward a small bench near the window. Please. Derrick didn't sit. He stood, hands folded calmly in front of him, posture steady, watching, waiting. There was a long pause before Whitmore spoke, his voice quieter than Derrick had ever heard it. I was wrong, he said finally. The words stiff, but real. I judged you without ever taking the time to know you. I assumed things. I thought I was being practical, business-minded, but I see now. He swallowed. I see now that I was being blind. Derrick said nothing. Whitmore looked away briefly, then back, his voice cracking at the edges. You saved my life. I mean, God, you had every reason to keep walking, but you didn't. You were there when no one else was. You didn't just show up, you acted. And Grace, she hasn't stopped talking about what you did. Another silence. I need someone like you, Whitmore continued. Reliable, composed, intelligent, loyal, someone who sees the bigger picture. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you your position back. More than that, I want to do it right this time. With proper recognition, respect. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Please, come back. Derrick looked at him. For a long moment, nothing moved. No reply, no expression. Just the quiet hum of the hospital machines marking the time. Then Derrick spoke. Slowly, his voice low, calm, and unshakably steady. You didn't just fire a driver, he said. You discarded a man. Whitmore flinched at the words. You looked at me for 4 years and never once saw me. Not as a father. Not as a man who worked double shifts to keep his daughter in school. Not as someone with a name, with pride. You used me, and when I was no longer convenient, you erased me like a smudge on your mirror. He stepped closer, his tone not angry, but honest. And now, you want to hire me back. As if the money can clean the slate. As if being seen matters only when I've saved your life. Whitmore's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Derrick looked over at Grace, still seated, eyes wet, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. Then he looked back at Whitmore, eyes firm, clear. You don't get to buy back what you never respected. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like it might never end. And then Derrick turned, without drama, without bitterness. Just quiet, resolute dignity. As he walked toward the door, Grace rose silently. Their eyes met hers, soft, knowing, full of something her father hadn't shown. Understanding. She gave the smallest nod, a gesture of both apology and gratitude. Derrick nodded back. No words. No speeches. Just mutual truth. He stepped into the hallway, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Outside, the evening sun was beginning to fall, casting warm golden light through the hospital windows. It painted the corridor in amber and shadow, and for the first time in days, Derrick let himself exhale fully. He didn't feel angry. He felt free. The morning light filtered through the trees as Derrick pulled out of his driveway, his modest sedan gleaming from the wash he'd given it just before sunrise. The streets were quiet, still stretching awake with the slow rhythm of a city that hadn't yet rushed into chaos. His phone buzzed on the dash. Another client confirmation. Mr. Carter, thank you again for yesterday. You were a blessing. See you Thursday. He smiled to himself, tapping heart on the message. Not long ago, silence had followed his service. No names, no thanks. Just tinted glass and closed doors. But that had changed. Carter rides had started. With nothing but old tires, hard-earned dignity, and a quiet hunger to be more than what the world had reduced him to. Now the car stayed busy. Bookings came in steady. Clients appreciated the calm of his presence, the way he opened doors for elderly passengers, remembered preferred routes, asked about their grandkids, or simply listened. People left 5-star reviews not just for their ride, but for their respect. They felt in his care. They didn't see a driver. They saw Derrick and Derrick. He was no longer driving to prove something to anyone. He was driving because it brought him peace, connection, purpose. On some days, he gave free rides to an old war veteran who lived down the block. On others, he picked up single mothers walking home from late shifts, refusing their money, only smiling when they tried to insist. "You got someone depending on you," he'd say. "That's payment enough." One Saturday afternoon, Derrick pulled up outside a library where a local event had wrapped. Children spilled onto the sidewalk with balloon animals and paper crowns, parents chatting near the steps. He was scheduled to drive a retired teacher home, a soft-spoken woman who'd spent 40 years in the public school system. As he helped her into the back seat, someone across the street caught his eye. Mr. Whitmore, standing beside a bench, alone, dressed more plainly than Derrick had ever seen. No suit, no phone in hand, just a quiet stillness that felt foreign on him. Their eyes met. Whitmore gave a faint nod. Derrick nodded back, cool, composed, no grudge, no invitation. Just truth. And in that moment, Whitmore's face carried something Derrick had never seen in him before. Not power, not pride, but humility. He hadn't seen Derrick since that night at the hospital, not in person. Grace had texted once months back to say thank you again, but nothing else followed. Still, Whitmore hadn't tried to call, hadn't made another offer. Maybe he knew better now, because that day hadn't just changed his heart rate. It had cracked open a part of him he'd long kept hidden. He would never forget it, not because he'd been saved, but because he'd been seen. In his weakest, most helpless moment, by the very man he'd once believed beneath him. Later that evening, Derrick drove through the neighborhood where he used to park Whitmore's luxury sedan, back when he was the man no one greeted. He passed the same gated mansions, the same manicured hedges, only now, he wasn't looking at what he didn't have. He was looking ahead, to the young father he just dropped off at his second job, to the elderly woman he'd be picking up from the pharmacy in 20 minutes, to the long road that stretched forward, not paved in gold, but in purpose. At a red light, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the gray hairs at his temple, the crow's feet from years of quiet smiles. He looked tired. He looked good. Back home, his kids ran to greet him at the door, yelling "Daddy's home," like he was some kind of superhero. His wife handed him a glass of iced tea, her eyes soft, warm, proud. "How was the day?" she asked. He leaned against the counter, sighing with quiet satisfaction. "Full," he said. "Good people, good stories." He didn't tell her about seeing Whitmore. He didn't need to, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about rising, and he had. Whitmore would go on to rebuild his health. He would return to his boardroom, soften a little, listen more. But no matter how many meetings he chaired, how many figures danced across his spreadsheets, there was one image he could never erase. The man he once ignored standing tall in a dusty parking lot, holding his daughter's hand, not out of duty, but out of humanity. Derrick never needed to prove his worth. The world had just taken too long to see it, but now they did, and that was enough.